Wulfrun of Scarsdale. Wulfrun closed his eyes. 3 years. 3 long years in the Holy Land, fighting the King's War, and he was finally home. He'd left with 6 men-at-arms and a personal servant, more than had been expected of him to provide. He returned with 3 of those men-at-arms, a serving girl as a present for his wife, and a small cart of silver. His wife. Wulfrun smiled. He was nearly back at Scarsdale. His daughter would be 10, soon old enough to seek a match for, but his wife, Freya, was beautiful. More beautiful than any queen, easily more beautiful than the serving girl or any of the Arabian girls he had seen in his time with the king's army. Freya. He had a hunger for her, an itch that increased the nearer to her he got. She could outdrink him. She could defend herself with a sword, though she, like him, preferred axes. She was better with a crossbow than he was. She was the mother of his daughter, Isolde. But Freya herself. Freya was the image of a goddess, and he worshipped her. She had been born with white hair, and eyes so pale they seemed silver. She wore furs from bears and wolves that she'd slain herself. But in their chamber, in front of the roaring log fire, out of the furs and leathers. Wulfrun growled to himself, feeling his itch grow. He missed the smell of her body. He missed her kisses and the feel of her breasts against his chest, the feel of her loins when he was inside her, the cries of savage delight as he plunged into her. He missed most, oddly enough, or perhaps not so oddly, given the length of time he had served in the king's army and what that had entailed, her smile, and the way he could talk about anything. He had done his service to the king, proved himself to be a loyal subject, and was now looking forward to seeing his daughter's face at the gifts he had brought back from the Holy Land for her, and taking his wife to their chamber, undressing and savouring her body, and ploughing her until he was drained of all he had to give. He would visit the families of the men who would not return in the new day. They had wages owed, and recompense for their loss. There would be hard times, but what he had been given as a share would soften that, would make the lives of his family, and those who owed servitude to him, a little easier. If he was not so eager to see his wife, he would have headed through the village, instead of turning aside to head straight home. It was mid-afternoon by his reckoning. He would take whatever food the kitchens could provide, or he would take sustenance, as Odin would have done, at Freya's lap. His heart rose as his house came into view. Solidly built, surrounded by thickets, except the pathway down which he rode. There was no way in except this trackway. He dismissed his men and they were gone, equally eager to be at their wives, and to reacquaint themselves with a life which wasn't boiling sands and interminable warfare. There were people in front of the house, more than he'd have hoped for. Rediscovering the taste of his wife would have to wait. He scowled. But he was back, and with a cart of treasure as well. "Wulfrun!" Freya's voice. He kicked his horse to a gallop. He recognised some of the liveries of the men-at-arms, and his wife's cry had been in warning. The men cleared before a tall, black-bearded warrior. Wulfrun slowed, not quite daring to reach for his axes. Magnus de Sylock was his overlord. With him was Rafe de Sancro, a knight he had brushes with in the Holy Land several times. "Freya, you invited guests to greet my return." He vaulted down from the horse. His broadsword was bundled up in the cart. He had a short sword on his back. "Did you think you could get away with your petty insults, Wulfrun of Scarsdale?" sneered de Sancro. "You insulted me more than once." "I fought for the king," he answered the knight, too tired to be cautious. "I did my feudal duty." Addressing de Sylock, "You honour me with your presence, but I have been on the road many a month, and am tired." De Sylock made a gesture. The men-at-arms were suddenly all holding crossbows, pointing at him or Freya. "I want Freya. Sir Rafe wants you destroyed. I want you dead. Sir Rafe wants you left alive." He shrugged. Sir Rafe won the discussion. "Father!" cried a young woman, breaking free. "Isolde!" His daughter had pale, flaxen hair, pale blue eyes. A man-at-arms caught her, lifted her up. A sword touched his throat. 2 men-at-arms moved in, seizing his wrists. Freya was being driven towards their house at sword point. Isolde was being carried towards it. "Tell them not to resist," sneered de Sancro, "or I shall have them knocked out first." "Freya!" bellowed Wulfrun, shaking one of the men-at-arms loose. "Fight!" Something struck the side of his head, and his vision swam. Freya was clubbed, dragged towards their house. She and Isolde were carried inside. Wulfrun raged, but there was no strength in his arms, and his legs felt like water. The men-at-arms returned moments later, though the lack of time spent inside offered no relief. Torches were being lit. Sir Sancro, he slurred, feeling woozy. De Sancro gestured. The torches were thrown. The house caught alight. Wulfrun surged to his feet, but staggered sideways. Freya and Isolde were inside, unconscious or worse. He ran for the house, bobbing and weaving automatically, though the men-at-arms made no move to stop him. One of the walls was a sheet of flame, with flames licking the doorway. Heat was broiling off it. Wulfrun lurched in through the burning doorway. The rooms off to both sides were aflame. His wife and daughter were further in. There was a roaring and a crashing behind him, and the heat at his back intensified. In the firelit gloom, he could make out a figure sprawled on the floor. Isolde! He scooped her up and ran, desperate now to return and find Freya. The doorway was ablaze. He ran through it, knocking burning wood aside, and rolled in the scorched grass, dropping his daughter. Without checking, he returned to the house, shielding his face as the wood spat flame and cracked all around him. In the main hall he found Freya, half conscious, bound to the table like she was to be the evening meal. The wall was aflame. Fire crackled in the ceiling, and wisps of flame and singed wood drifted down. "Freya! Wulfrun!" He clambered onto the table, shielding her. "Wulfrun!" she begged. "Get away from here! Look after Isolde!" "Not without you, my love!" She was tightly bound at both wrists and ankles. He pulled feverishly at the bonds, but they were tight. "Do not risk yourself. Go! Save Isolde!" The ceiling exploded. Wulfrun felt the fire wash across his back, felt the ceiling begin to collapse upon him. "I will not leave!" "Wulfrun!" Freya screamed. Wulfrun turned his head. A massive strut, a blaze, ploughed into him, knocking him off the table. He rolled, feeling the burns and the bleeding. Freya was screaming. The strut had fallen onto her, and her clothing was alight. Wulfrun drew the short sword, hacking desperately at the binding knots, pausing to heft the strut off Freya. He tore his own outer tunic off, flinging it over her, putting the flames out, aware of the scent of burning skin, and returned to severing her bonds. He lifted her from the table, fire all around, her body little more than a rag doll's, singed and broken. He staggered towards the front of the house. Isolde was there. Freya would survive. Freya was strong. He needed Freya. Something exploded to one side, and flames washed over him for an instant. He staggered on as best he could. The front of the house was smoking logs, crumbled down, exploding, still burning. He staggered away from the house, towards where Isolde lay. He dropped to his knees, losing his grip on Freya, unable to look at her until he checked Isolde. Isolde's throat was cut. Neatly. Little blood. He raised his head. The men-at-arms and the two bastards were withdrawing. Wulfrun turned his attention to Freya. Her ribs were broken. Her skin was burned, her hair crisp. Her gaze empty. He closed his eyes, slumped forwards, falling atop Freya, and passed out.